If you want to help Myth Vision Podcast grow, you can join our Patreon. There are different tiers, as well as help out with PayPal. Thank you so much. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment. Ladies and gentlemen, we are Myth Vision. I just wanted to show you guys something glorious before I get into this. That right there is the queen of my life. Sorry the room's a mess, but we're over here. Just moved into our new house, and I'm about to try to chip away at something the best I can. I had to write this up. We had to have this documented, if you will, because it's just too much to go over. So, it's the Messianic New Covenant Israelitism. On August the 14th, my friend Jason DaCosta put a video discussing the views of Dr. Jason Staples from the perspective of Israel only. And today he put out yet another video discussing Dr. Staples. And I have to say, as much as I was really looking forward to hearing Jason's take, because he has some really good videos, I think there's some major issues with his analysis. So I'd like to take the time to set the record straight for Jason and others. And before I even start, I want you to know, I honestly think that if me and him hung out in person and I was still drinking, I said this the other day, we would have beers together and hang out, probably have, cookout, family hangouts, things like that. I think he's a great guy. I think he's a very likable dude. I think he just seems really cool, chill guy. And he knows a lot, man. He's a brilliant guy. He knows what he's talking about. So I want to present this. I do like him. He's a very smart, insightful person when it comes to the Bible and Israel only. But I think he's wrong about a few things, and I'd like to point them out for his benefit. Now, of course, before we get on, the scholars and the others, they're going to be bringing in stuff that may not even be discussed in this video. So we'll be looking forward to Dr. Carrier, Dr. Staples' interview with me, and technically this is just me putting some notes together and trying to set the record straight. This is not my opinion against his, Jason DaCosta. I'd like to focus strictly on Dr. Staples' work and where I think Jason DaCosta may be misrepresenting it. And I'll try to refer to these gentlemen as Dr. Staples and DaCosta wherever I can, just so I don't confuse their names, same Jason. So I hope this doesn't come off rude in any way. I want to specify that, and I am going to be reading this, so bear with me. I had to type this out. Dr. Staples' article was published 9 years ago in the Journal of Biblical Literature. It's called, "What Do the Gentiles Have to Do with All Israel?" A fresh look at Romans 11:25 through 27. It's great that IOers like Jason DaCosta are finally getting around to addressing it, but I think they really need to read it carefully before they get too excited about where they think Dr. Staples might agree with their theory. However, DaCosta did admit in his first video on August the 14th that he only read some of Dr. Staples' recent post on Bart Ehrman's blog and that he should have paid better attention to it. He also committed to reading the blog post in the future and to give a thorough response, which I really hope he does. And he admitted that he really needs to read Staples' 2011 article a second time. I totally promote that because it's 20 pages and has a lot of information to absorb. I agree that it's definitely worth rereading. Now, after DaCosta's initial reading, right off the bat, he commends Dr. Staples for coming very close to the Israel-only position. He commends Dr. Staples for making the correct distinction between important terms such as Jews being a subset of the Israelites. DaCosta basically takes a victory lap for Israel only, claiming that Dr. Staples' work 100% backs up his Israel-only view. Now, I put in quotations because a lot of this stuff is actually verbatim in the video response that he did on Dr. Staples, which wasn't a long video. It was a quick video. And so he says it backs up Israel only 100%. He characterizes Dr. Staples as a complete IOer type scholar in terms of his understanding of Romans 11. Now that really seems like a shining endorsement. However, he accuses Dr. Staples of going wrong on one particular point. Based on what he can recall of the article, and he admits they could be wrong about this, he says that he's under the impression that Dr. Staples is a so-called wannabe Israelite. In other words, he's a Christian. So Dr. Staples necessarily believes that he's part of the narrative and that Israelites are still being saved today. This is inconsistency at its finest. according to DaCosta. It seems like being a Christian essentially disqualifies a person from evaluating the evidence objectively. And that can happen, don't get me wrong, but he's definitely using this as an argument. So according to DaCosta, there's a problem with Staples' theology off the top because allegedly he's not recognizing the eschatological nature of those last days. And what was all coming to a close and when that would be. That being the destruction of the temple. And this is full preterism. Allegedly, he's at a disadvantage in believing that he's part of the program and part of the gospel mission. DaCosta asserts that Dr. Staples needs to come out of Christianity a little bit in order to understand that. It makes a lot more sense if we exclusify it down to Israel. But DaCosta is careful to repeatedly point out he could be wrong. He could be wrong. And I think he actually is wrong about Dr. Staples. Now I'll try to explain why that is. As an aside, I'd like to point out that starting a critique of Dr. Staples with these accusations does seem to be a textbook example of both a strawman fallacy, not addressing the stillman version of Staples' argument, and poisoning the well, preemptively presenting irrelevant information in order to discredit someone. So he's a Christian, don't listen to him. He's wrong automatically. You can poison the well in these areas. So I'm sure DaCosta is simply trying to point out Staples' biases up front, but I don't think this is valid if he can't actually point out instances where Staples' biases are getting in the way. In any case, the so-called error that DaCosta points out is this. According to Dr. Staples, as expressed by DaCosta, non-elect Gentiles are inside of the salvation narrative, along with Gentilized Israelites of the northern tribes. Here's exactly what he says in quotes. Basically, what Dr. Staples does is understands that a lot of these saved Gentiles being gathered in from the nations are actually the dispersed Israelites. They're the northern tribes. They're the paganized Israelites who've been gathered back in to fulfill the mission to save all Israel. But he then goes on to add that other Gentiles were added in alongside. So in other words, this ingathering of the Israelites from the nations would open up the door, so to speak, to allow other real Gentiles in. And DaCosta claims that there are two problems with that, according to the narrative. One, the eschatological nature and how it all ended. All the elect would be raised, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. And number two, the fullness of the nations had to come in by the end, which was within the generation before some of them standing there would die. So basically, if I understand DaCosta correctly, Dr. Staples is refuted by the a priori assumption that full preterism is true, and that Paul was somehow aware of the events that would transpire after his death. But I think we could safely assume that the doctrine of full preterism is not within the scope of Dr. Staples' analysis, as it's just not something that Bible scholars tend to take into consideration. So obviously, this is just something full preterists have to deal with when evaluating Bible scholarship in general. DaCosta goes on to question Dr. Staples in a way that seems to beg the question that IO doctrine is in fact established as being true. Are more than the elect coming in? Elect is always a term that refers to biological Israel, never Gentiles who have faith. Now I want to point out that DaCosta does consistently fall back on the idea that anything is possible in the realm of supernatural make-believe. The story is a supernatural tell, an ideal story that is not concerned with such historical plausibility, etc. Clearly, anything can happen in a fictitious narrative. Well, anything but the inclusion of the actual non-Israelite Gentiles into the communities Paul is addressing. That's just illogical, according to DaCosta. Now, if anyone thinks I'm strawmanning DaCosta here, I'll provide links to the first video and second video he recently put out. I'm happy to be fact-checked on this all day. Today's video basically reiterates all the points I just mentioned. That Jason Staples is allegedly a futurist Christian. DaCosta affirms that these futurist Christians must necessarily assume that the Israelites are still being gathered, because the fullness of the nations has not come in yet. So by default, all Israel has not been saved. And this is supposedly the clincher against Dr. Staples' entire thesis. It seems like the implications is that Dr. Staples must necessarily be blinded by his religious bias that necessarily render him incapable of providing an objective analysis of the text. Now that's an interesting aspect of DaCosta's view that's worth pointing out here. On the one hand, the epistles of Paul are supposedly fictional. Now, I don't know what this means exactly. Perhaps they're epistolary fiction, like they were written to fake audiences and describing made-up situations. Epistolary fiction was a thing in the ancient world. However, DaCosta and other IOers seems to frequently contradict this view by claiming that there were, in fact, in actual history, ethnically distinct paganized northern Israelites dispersed throughout the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD. He frequently supports this assertion by quoting a single passage in Josephus and by referencing the Maccabean literature. He dismisses any skepticism in his historical proposition, so just take note of this apparent contradiction here. 1. Either we're dealing with fake epistles written to fake Christian audiences that consist exclusively of Israelites, regardless of who these people were in actual history, or we're dealing with real letters written to real people who actually existed in history, and these people were all actually Jews or distinct paganized northern Israelites. I'll just keep this issue in mind. I'll touch on it later, so just don't forget about that. Now let's transition from DaCosta and take a look at what Dr. Staples actually says to determine if DaCosta is accurately characterizing the Stillman version of Dr. Staples' thesis. You can judge for yourself. In terms of what Staples posted on Bart Ehrman's blog in July and August, most of it recapitulates the content of his 20-page article. I'll provide links to the blog post. Those who want to explore it, he made 3 posts in total. And by the way, he responds to questions. So if you want to ask him a question, he responds. And I've asked the IOers to please write questions. And I'd like to see the engagement of what he responds to the IOers who are promoting their view and trying to test him, because this would be the guy that's so close, you know? Number 1 on these posts, he says, what does Paul mean by all Israel will be saved? The post number 2 on Ehrman's blog, why does Paul switch from talking about Jews to Israel? And post number 3 is, did Jesus fail to restore Israel? Paul's solution to the problem. I do want to touch on a couple of things that Dr. Staples wrote in the blog post and in the comments underneath the post, which may be helpful for this analysis. Someone in the comments asked Dr. Staples to define the term Gentile. Here's his answer. Quote, Gentile is just an English rendering of the ancient Hebrew and Greek words for nation, goy, and ethnos, respectively. In the Hebrew Bible, the nations are the various people groups across the earth, of which Israel is the one specifically chosen to be Yahweh's covenant people. On occasion, the nations is used as shorthand to refer to the nations other than Israel. This latter use of the term becomes more common in the literature of late Second Temple period, and in the New Testament, the nations almost always refers to everyone else. Paul uses the collective noun nations or nation to refer both to non-Jewish groups and to individuals within those people groups, akin to using America to refer to the collective or to Americans, a use that we also find in later rabbinic literature. I can't, or at least won't, go into more detail here, but if you're really interested in more detail, I suggest taking a look at Ishay Rosenzai, I may not be pronouncing his last name correct, and Adi Afir's 2018 book, Goy, which engages in a highly detailed and quite technical, theoretical at times, history of the term. Their hypothesis, which I'm sure I fully agree with, is that Paul's use of the term to refer to individuals is in fact an innovation. End quote. I'll post a link in the description to the article by Rosenzai, I hope I'm pronouncing it correct, and Ophir, about the term Gentile. In any case, anyone who wants to check it out, I'll post a link to the blog post and to Staples' article. Here are a couple of key sections from Staples' second and third post. Quote, putting the pieces together, Paul appears to read Hosea as a twofold prophecy. Twofold. each directly involving Gentiles or Gentile status. First, Northern Israel would no longer be distinct from the rest of the nations. They effectively become Gentiles. This does not seem to be what happened with the Northern Israelites who were scattered by Assyria. They intermarried with other peoples, thus assimilating into those groups and ceasing to be their own separate ethnic group. But at some later time, and this is the part Paul specifically quotes, God will restore Israel from being not my people, Gentiles, to put it plainly. Much of Israel has gone native and become Gentiles. So now God is fulfilling his promise to restore Israel by incorporating Gentiles. The Assyrians were experts at breaking up rebellious people groups. Their primary strategy was to deport much of the population, dispersing them among different regions of the Assyrian Empire, ensuring that they were spread too thin to unify and rebel again. And within a few generations, these dispersed groups would typically intermarry among the other people groups in those areas, effectively losing their distinct ethnic identity and becoming melting pot Assyrians. Such practices are considered genocide by today's standards. This is ultimately what happened to the northern kingdom of Israel. As Assyria deported large portions of the population, scattering them into separate areas for a theologically charged and hyperbolic account of these deportions, see 2 Kings 17, end quote. Another question that was posed to Staples on the second blog post relates to the Josephus passage that DaCosta keeps referencing as proof that there were, in fact, northern Israelites dispersed throughout the Roman Empire. I'll give you the whole passage in question and provide a link below to provide context for the question I'm about to read. This is what Josephus says in Antiquities Book 11, Chapter 5, Section 2, line 133. Quote, "But then the entire body of the people of Israel, Israelites, remained in that country." The entire body of the people of Israel, Israelites, remained in that country. Wherefore there are but 2 tribes in Asia and Europe subject to the Romans, only 2, while the 10 tribes are beyond the Euphrates till now, and are an immense multitude and not to be estimated by numbers. Interesting, end quote. The interesting part's not part of the quote, but that's just me saying that out loud to emphasize. Now, Josephus clearly states that Asia and Europe were home to only 2 tribes, and that the remaining 10 are beyond the Euphrates. However, there seems to be a very popular opinion among Ioers that beyond the Euphrates somehow encompasses Asia Minor. Pause 1 second here. I am going to exit this so I don't hear it. Okay. Beyond the Euphrates somehow encompasses Asia Minor. To illustrate this point, here's a map posted recently in an IO group that illustrates Ephraim being dispersed all over the West. Note, however, that this map doesn't illustrate Ephraim's dispersion as far as Spain, which is where Paul claims he was going in Romans 15:24 after passing through Rome. Note, where the Euphrates is on that map, on the far right, now with that in mind, here's a question that was asked to Dr. Staples in the comments regarding Josephus' passage. Quote, "If Josephus claims there were numerous descendants of the northern tribes beyond the Euphrates, and that only the southern tribes returned, why do you suggest that the Assyrians effectively, ethnically cleansed them out of existence, and that there were no 12 tribes in Jesus' day? Do you mean that there were simply no 12 tribes in that particular region in Jesus' day? Or do you outright discredit Josephus' account? 2 Kings 17:6 says that the king of Assyria settled Israel in Halah and Habor, on the river of the Gozan, and in the cities of Medes. 2 Esdras 13:39-49 claims that 9 tribes were miraculously led across the Euphrates and wandered for a year and a half to a distant region called Arzareth, another land, where allegedly human beings had never lived or had ever lived. It goes on to prophesy their return in the end times, when the Most High will miraculously lead them home. If it was a common knowledge that the lost tribes were in that particular location, why don't we see a concerted effort on the part of early Christians in the New Testament to spread the gospel to those lost Israelites in particular? End quote. Here is Staples' answer to that question. Quote, "Good question. The best explanation is that the perspective of Josephus and 2nd Esdras was not common knowledge in that period. They present only one of quite a few opinions for the fate of the northern tribes in operation in that period. There's a debate in the Mishnah, for example, in which one of the rabbis, R. Joshua, argues that the nations scattered by the Assyrians no longer exist as ethnically distinct entities. Yad 4 verse 4. Other sources, such as Tobit, have other perspectives on the issue. There also no evidence for Josephus' claim that there were 10 distinct Israelite tribes across the Euphrates somewhere. It seems to have been a matter of faith for him, not an empirical claim." End quote. Here's part of a follow-up response to Staples. Quote, "In terms of the other options available in the first century Jews, Christians, are there any empirical claims that the 10 lost tribes dispersed among the nations were still ethnically distinct entities, contra Rabbi Joshua, that had since moved west into the dispersion of the Roman Empire, separate from the Jewish diaspora, southern tribes?" End quote. Here's Jason's response, Dr. Staples. Those who thought there were still ethnically distinct entities typically imagine them as across the Euphrates somewhere in the east. Note that Josephus draws the distinction between those who are under the Roman Empire, those from the southern tribes, and the remnant of the other 10 tribes, which he envisions as an innumerable multitude somewhere in the east. The one potential point of contact for the idea of the Israelite remnants in the west is Hosea 11 verse 10. His children will come trembling from the Mediterranean Sea, but that's tenuous at best. I think it's probably more accurate to say that the earliest Christians who left records thought Israel had been scattered to the four corners of the earth or to the ends of the earth, and therefore had been scattered and intermingled everywhere. I do think James 1 verse 1 and 1 Peter understand the tribes of Israel as having been scattered and mixed everywhere, and have adopted the same view that the next post argues is reflected in Paul, understanding those Gentiles who have been incorporated in the Jesus movement as members of a renewed 12-tribe Israel and effectively resurrected Israelites. I don't think there's strong evidence that the Gentile converts imagined themselves as biological descendants of Jacob. Paul refers to them as descendants of the patriarchs, but he emphasizes they've become such by receiving the Spirit and participation in Christ. The first person plurals, especially 1 Corinthians 10 verse 1, and his insistence that Abraham is the father of all the faithful, Romans 4 verse 12 through 16, work pretty powerfully together on that front. Galatians also argues strongly that the uncircumcised faithful are already reckoned as Abraham's seed, which would make them descendants of the patriarchs by the work of the Spirit. End quote. Staples' article, so I think it should be clear from those excerpts from Ehrman's blog that Jason DaCosta probably doesn't fully grasp the extent to which Dr. Staples' views actually clash with IO. But since he admits to having only partially reading through the blog post, let's see what Dr. Staples says in his actual 2011 article that DaCosta actually read. Staples starts by outlining four major interpretations of all Israel in Romans 11:25 and on. Number one, the ecclesiastical interpretations, which equates Israel and the church arguing against defining Israel on ethnic grounds, based on Paul's redefinition of Israel in Romans 9 verse 6. Number two, the total national elect view, which argues that the complete number of elect from the historic empirical nation, i.e. all elect Jews, which would be something that Dr. Price would talk about, will be saved in the same manner as the Gentiles, i.e. through Christ. Number three, the two covenant perspective, which is held by a small minority contingent of scholars holding to a two-covenant perspective, arguing that both the all and Israel should be taken at face value, to mean that every individual Jew will be saved by membership in the Jewish covenant, regardless of their reception of the gospel. And think about that for a second, guys. That's a held scholarly position. I suspect it's a minority, but there are people who hold it, that all that existed in the first century really were Jewish people. There wasn't the 10 tribes in actual evident existence. They had been assimilated. Anyway, I'm messing up. Number 4, the eschatological miracle position, in which Paul envisions a future salvation of all Jews at or immediately prior to the eschaton, presently holds the majority. So after the fullness of the Gentiles, Romans 11:25, has come in, the Jews will finally be saved all at once, probably through some mass conversion, and a small minority advocate for some kind of retroactive salvation for all Jews throughout history. Staples provides a handy illustration of the relationship between the concepts of Israel versus Jews. According to Dr. Staples, the strong consensus view is that Israel must mean all ethnic or empirical Israel, all Jews. This is represented by the article on the left. However, this is not Staples' own view. So Staples sets out to answer 3 primary interpretive questions. How does Paul define all Israel, and what does Paul mean the fullness of the nations? And how is the salvation of all Israel related to the ingathering of the fullness of the nations? In summary, Staples' article seeks to answer the question, what does the ingathering of the fullness of the Gentiles have to do with the salvation of all Israel, the heart of I.O.? He outlines the following definitions for the terms Israel, as it is used in the Hebrew Bible: the patriarch, Jacob, Israel; the nation composed of his descendants, that is, all 12 tribes of Israel, including Judah; the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes of the house of Israel, excluding the southern kingdom and the house of Judah, separate; and the returnees from Judah after the Babylonian exile. Staples claims that the evidence points to the fact that the first century Jews, Paul in particular, continued to make the distinction of all Israel as referring to all 12 tribes as a whole. Josephus certainly upholds the distinction referring to Israelites in antiquity and in Antiquities only, capitals, only in the book Antiquities, in reference to the pre-exilic and exilic periods. According to Staples, once the northern tribes are off the scene, Josephus restricts himself to more precise terminology referring only to the southern tribes. He no longer speaks of Israel, but only the Jews. For ease of reference, here are the historical periods we're talking about. Here are some key quotations of Dr. Staples' paper, which I have broken up and redacted to present the salient points. Quote number 1. The Qumran community was not alone in anticipating a full restoration of the northern tribes. For Ezra 13, verse 40 through 47, expects the eschatological restoration of the 10 tribes still lost in exile, as does Testament of Benjamin 10, which connects this restoration with the resurrection and the Lord revealing his salvation to all nations. Number 2, evidence from the early Jesus movement suggests similar expectations. Jesus' selection of the 12 and his promise that they would judge the 12 tribes clearly demonstrate anticipation of a pan-Israelite restoration, as does his promise that the Son of Man will gather the elect from the 4 winds. Number 3, the present consensus notwithstanding, Paul also makes it abundantly clear in Romans 9 verse 6 that when he says Israel, he does not restrict his meaning to ethnic Jews, nor does he think all who are born Jews are Israel. In addition, Paul frames his ministry in New Covenant language, suggesting the centrality of the restoration of all Israel to his gospel. In considering the role of the New Covenant in Paul's proclamation, it is critical to remember that Jeremiah's prophecy primarily concerns the reconstitution of all Israel. That is, both Israel and Judah will be restored by means of God's writing the law on their hearts. In fact, the prophecy is part of the larger section promising the return of the northern kingdom and the reunification of all 12 tribes. Significantly, Gentiles are not mentioned in Jeremiah's prophecy. The covenant will be made with only Israel and Judah. Thus, if Paul thought that the new covenant was being fulfilled, he would have been expecting the miraculous return of the northern tribes. Instead, he strangely obsesses over the mystery of the circumcision-free justification of the Gentiles, while still insisting that he is preaching the fulfillment of the new covenant. It is in pondering this paradox that all the pieces snap together. Paul's mystery is that faithful Gentiles, those with the law written on their hearts, see Romans 2, verse 14 through 15, are the returning remnant of the house of Israel, united with the faithful from the house of Judah, the inward Jews of Romans 2, 28 through 29. Identifying faithful Gentiles with the returning house of Israel obviously assigns much more significance to Romans 9, 23 through 26, where after first declaring natural ancestry and an insufficient criterion for covenant membership, 9, 6 through 13, he's talking about who the promises are for and all that, but he even goes to make the point, just because you're a descendant doesn't mean you're one of them. All right, it's the chosen, right? And defending God's justice in election. Who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Paul quotes Hosea's words to the northern kingdom, demonstrating that God is calling his elect. The house of Israel has intermarried among the nations, no longer having the distinction of being elect. Once a part of God's elect nation, Ephraim has become not my people, indistinct from the non-chosen nations. That is, they have become Gentiles. What does not my people mean if not Gentiles? Hosea 8, verse 8 sums up the situation. Israel, the north, is swallowed up. They are now in the nations, Gentiles, like a worthless vessel. Paul appears to be subtly echoing this passage when he defends God's choice in making some of the lump, Israel, into worthless vessels for dishonor, leading to the inclusion of the Gentiles, citing Hosea's promise of the restoration of not my people as proof. Uncircumcised Gentiles, with the not my people being restored to Israel as promised in Hosea. So Paul takes the radical step of identifying faithful, that is to say, as promised, Ephraim's seed is being restored from among the nations, being redeemed from its cut off Gentile state, becoming children of the living God once again. Moreover, in the process, God has provided for the salvation of the Gentiles by scattering Ephraim among the nations, only to be restored in saving Ephraim. God saves the nations. In saving the nations, God saves Ephraim. Thus, the new covenant not only restores Israel, but also in the unforeseen plan of God, fulfills the promises to Abraham that all the nations would be blessed, not through his seed, i.e. as outsiders, but by inclusion and incorporation in his seed. Galatians 3:8. Paul insists that these faithful Gentiles are not to become Jews, that is, Judah. In order to become members of Israel, rather, they have already become Israelites through the new covenant. Thus, all persons should remain in the state in which they were called. 1 Corinthians 7, 17 through 20. Before protesting that Paul would never have called Gentiles Israelites, one should remember that the circumcision controversy makes sense only if the debate is over full Israelite status. If Gentiles were to be saved simply as Gentiles, i.e., as the fulfillment of the nations flocking to Jerusalem at the eschaton, circumcision, which marks a status transition from Gentile to Israelite, would have been entirely unnecessary. Why would Gentiles ever need to be circumcised to worship the God of Israel? And on what basis would they be circumcised if not to become part of Israel? If uncircumcised Gentiles could already worship the Lord with somewhat secure status in non-Christian Judaism, there is little reason to think that such a thing would have been a problem in even the most conservative law-observant Christian circles. Rather, the debate must have been centered on the question of whether Gentile converts can acquire full Israelite status without circumcision, food laws, or any other visible marker of the identification with Torah or traditional Jewish identity. For Paul, Gentile converts are not saved as Gentiles, but actually become equal members of Israel alongside their law-observant Jewish brothers. It is this assertion that was so unbearable for Paul's opponents. Gentiles saved as Gentiles are no concern. Gentiles as Israel are a shocking affront and a grave threat to traditional Israelite identity. The debate is therefore fundamentally over status, specifically the status and identity of the people of Israel. It is precisely at this point that Paul is simultaneously most continuous and discontinuous with traditional Judaism. He continues to preach God's special election of Israel, the lasting value of Israel's covenant, and the restoration and ultimate salvation of Israel, but he extends this election to Gentiles without any requirement of circumcision, food laws, or any other external markers of covenantal membership. An unacceptable move in the eyes of his peers, both Jesus followers and those who were not. In this sense, Paul's gospel could most accurately be called Messianic New Covenant Israelitism. Not exactly Judaism, but in no way something wholly other, far from de-emphasizing the Torah and the prophets. Paul sees the prophecies contained therein as being fulfilled in his own day and through his ministry. Israel is indeed being restored from the nations through an internal transformation, just as the prophets foretold. The Gentiles now receiving the Spirit are the fulfillment of Jacob's prophecy. They are Ephraim's seed. They are Israel, restored through the new covenant. God had planned all along that Ephraim's seed would become the fullness of the nations, so that when Ephraim was restored, it would result also in the redemption of the Gentiles in Abraham's seed. Paul's triumphant conclusion, and thus all Israel will be saved, seizes his opponent's territory, claiming it for the Pauline gospel. Yes, all Israel will be saved, he says, but all Israel is more than you realize. Israel's redemption is not limited to the Jews alone. God has promised to restore all Israel and Ephraim, that is, the fullness of the nations. Gentiles must be reincorporated into Israel and reunited with his Jewish brothers. All Israel can be saved only through the ingathering of the nations. The puzzling connection between the ingathering of the fullness of the nations and the salvation of all Israel suddenly makes sense, since all Israel must include Ephraim's seed. Romans 11:25-27 is thus entirely coherent. Verse 25. A hardening has happened to part of Israel. Paul starts from the original hardening of the northern kingdom, which caused them to be exiled by the Assyrians and intermingled with the nations. Judah's partial hardening then leads to the restoration of these lost tribes, necessarily opening the door to the Gentiles. Since Ephraim is no longer ethnically distinct, the Gentiles are gathered in as the result of this twofold hardening that has occurred in both houses of Israel. Nonetheless, Paul insists that even those branches presently being cut off for unfaithfulness can be grafted on again. The mercy being shown to the northern house is the guarantor of mercy towards disobedient Jews. They can, Paul seems to hold more than a little hope that they will, be restored. And this ultimate reincorporation and reunification are the greatest of all. Life from the dead, Romans 11:15. Until the fullness of the nations comes in, this is, as we have already seen, a double reference. It refers to the ingathering of the Gentiles into Israel, but in their new identity as the reconstituted Ephraim, the forgotten, uncultivated olive branches that had long been cut off are now being grafted onto the olive tree of Israel. Paul is simultaneously proclaiming the salvation of the Gentiles and the return of the northern kingdom as the same event. Verse 26, and thus all Israel will be saved, or all Israel will be saved, since all Israel includes both houses of Israel, and the northern house is distinct from the nations. All Israel must include both Jews and Gentiles. There is a causal relation between the ingathering of the Gentiles and the salvation of all Israel. because the latter necessarily involves the restoration of Ephraim's seed, which has become the fullness of the Gentiles. Just as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them. When I take away their sins, this is the mechanism of Israel's salvation, the new covenant. All those who have the law written on their heart, Jew or Gentile, are Israelites. Romans chapter 2. Paul follows with the reminder that even unbelieving Jews have in no way lost their elect status. They remain God's elect in every sense that a faithful Gentile is, despite their opposition to the gospel. God has not made a mistake. He has not turned back from his promises, nor does he regret his choices. There's no cause for boasting, but only love and an attitude of brotherhood toward the fellow elect, along with hope of their ultimate reconciliation and participation in the new covenant, leading to their salvation. 9:1-5. I believe this is Romans 9, verses 1-5. Unlike later patristic writers, Paul does not advocate a primarily Gentile church which did not yet exist as the new or true Israel replacing the Jews, nor is he teaching a third race perspective. On the contrary, the ecclesia, comprised both Jews and Gentiles, is the congregation of the Lord, Deuteronomy 23 verse 1, in direct continuity with the ancient Israel. Gentiles coming into the body of Christ indeed become members of Israel, but they are no way replacements. They are restorations and additions. Jews remain Israel by nature. The ingrafting of Gentiles does not threaten or diminish their Israelite status. Both Jews and Gentiles, however, can find themselves cut off from Israel because of unfaithfulness. Through restoration, though restoration is possible, even then Paul envisions the expansion of Israel by restoration and addition, not to transfer of Israelite status from one group to another. Even Gentile inclusion itself is in continuity with ancient Israel, since Israel has been ethnically intermingled among the nations, requiring Gentile inclusion for Israelite restoration. For Paul, salvation is always about God's faithfulness to his people Israel. In Romans 11:25-27 and Romans 9-11 as a whole, the apostle has turned the question of God's rejection of Israel on its head by reminding the reader that all Israel is a larger entity than just Jews. God has neither been unfaithful to Israel nor rejected his people. In fact, God's plan goes far beyond saving only Judah, but extends to the house of Israel as well. All Israel will be saved, Paul insists, not just one part. Far from rejecting Israel, God has reached out and saved more of Israel than anyone could have imagined. In fact, God desired to save all Israel so much that he is even incorporating the Gentiles to do it. God's faithfulness to Israel is so great that he has provided to save all, even Gentiles, in Israel. God has not moved to a new people, but is gathering, restoring, and reconciling even those who were thought to be irretrievably lost. Paul argues that God's covenant-keeping power extends beyond the grave, capable even of bringing life from the dead, Romans 11, verse 15, of producing Israelites from the Gentiles. It is no wonder that Paul breaks off in praise at this point, expressing his wonder at the hidden wisdom, the unsearchable and unfathomable plan of God. The mystery has been revealed, and God's purposes are far deeper than anyone ever imagined. Even God's rejections prove salvific. Now, this is all from Jason Staples, Dr. Staples' mouth, and I apologize for the errors and the mess-ups there. I'm reading this from the script as well as directly from the horse's mouth. I did skip over key sections of Staples' article, so everyone should definitely check out. Suffice it to say, he doesn't draw the same conclusions as I.O. So Jason DaCosta may want to consider withdrawing his endorsement. Now let's recap some of the points that Jason DaCosta took away from his initial reading everything that I just read above. Number one, Dr. Staples allegedly believes that non-elect Gentiles are inside of the salvation narrative, along with Gentilized Israelites of the northern tribes, that these were actually the paganized, dispersed Israelites of the northern tribes in real history? Question mark. Dr. Staples allegedly believes that actual non-Israelite Gentiles were added in alongside these Gentilized Northern Israelites, that this was a completely separate group of people. I think DaCosta's summary strains credulity, having read what Dr. Staples actually wrote. What about these two separate narratives that Staples supposedly invented? Were there actually Israelites being gathered? And were these Israelites actually being gathered so that God could save other people alongside Israel? I think those questions have been answered by Staples himself. Dr. Staples is not conflating the term Gentile with ethnic Israelites at all. Dr. Staples simply holds the consensus view. When Paul refers to his audience as Gentiles, he means it in the conventional sense. So Dr. Staples' view simply does not conform to IO on this point. Full stop. And since DaCosta has admitted on several occasions that he could be wrong about this, I'm sure he'll have no issue acknowledging that he was. Moving forward, perhaps he could start to address some of Dr. Staples' actual arguments rather than strawmanning and poisoning the well, so to speak. I continue to encourage all IO adherents or adherents of IO to join Dr. Ehrman's blog and ask him questions that pertain to IO. The opportunity is there for you to seize, and I hope I helped give everyone a clearer perspective moving forward. Perhaps he could start to address Dr. Staples' actual arguments. I think that'll be important. And once Dr. Richard Carrier is able to wrap his head around all of this, both the IO perspective and Dr. Staples' perspective, both their works, he'll be able to offer an even more insight on the historical questions related to the lost tribes and the early Christian communities Paul was writing to in his letters. I know that was a lot. I read a lot, guys. I apologize, but I really do like Jason. I can listen to Jason DaCosta all day long. He's well-spoken. He articulates what he thinks very well. And I think we would hang out in person. Just the kind of character that he is. He seems like he would be a really chill guy to hang out with. And I hope that covers some points. And I just want to reemphasize one thing before we close out here. What I mentioned earlier, that, he says that this could be fiction. I see a huge struggle in the field of actual history, and these are just fictional writings. I agree there's historical fiction, but are Paul's letters historical fiction? Look, I'm not saying that they couldn't have fraud. Some of these could be written as forged letters or whatever. Is Dr. Price right about some of these letters? Are we going to argue that the 7 authentic, as critical scholars believe, the 7 are authentic of the Pauline corpus? All this stuff. The dating of these texts play a role in full preterism. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about here. But my point is the fictional and the historical seem to be something that both get tapped on. And if something isn't written, and I'm not trying to say, well, if it's not written, we win. No. How the hell can anyone decipher this position? It's supposed to be as clear as day. But if we're not reading this book spelled out on the IO perspective in a manner in which they're very clearly trying to make their case, you got to make a case for this. People don't just read Greek and it can mean lost diaspora Israelite biologically out in the nation. Okay, so it needs to be spelled out and it needs to be well articulated. And so the idea that these could be, it's all fiction and therefore couldn't they write a real fiction even if in history there weren't actual Israelites out there, but in the same breath still try to argue that there were really lost Israelites using Maccabees and Josephus and stuff to make the point, and Staples totally cuts through that like a hot knife through butter. There's a problem with that. How come the same fiction couldn't include people that never really were openly part of the narrative? It's a fiction. I mean, why can't that be what's going on? So digest that, chew on that. I expect, obviously, Jason DaCosta to do a response to this. I'm not going to probably respond to that. I'm going to wait for the scholars to really come in and, deal with the position in full depth using historical sources, extra biblical material, like I've referenced a few extra biblical material in pseudepigraphical writings, other books that aren't in our canon to make the point. But I definitely cannot wait for Dr. Carrier, and I cannot wait for Dr. Staples, and I plan on getting Dr. Paula Fredrickson. Fingers crossed we can get her on the channel. Others like Christine Hayes. Maybe I can get some of these other people who wrote on the Goy, the Goyim, talk about them and who they think Paul's audience was and why, all these things. But I don't want to directly necessarily engage IO. Once these scholars come out, I'll let IO engage these scholars, and at that point, I'm going to plan on trying to progressively move forward in the situation, hopefully the things that these scholars bring are somewhat edifying to the situation. And both sides learn something from this, and not just, oh, I'm wrong, let me throw my dung from my castle and say how you guys are all wrong. No, argue your point. Got it. But take it to the scholar. I want to hear what they have to say. I'm interested in seeing how you guys can, pan up against them in their arguments that they will be presenting. So we'll go from there. But definitely read Jason Staples' article for yourself to see. He's the closest thing I know of in the scholarly world who even comes close to answering something similar to IO, but he's miles apart in many ways. So with that being said, thanks for being patient and getting to the end of this video. Peace.